We're talking weeks, maybe months. How much worse could this get?
Well, it could get considerably worse. The oil market is always trying to price both the duration and the volume of a disruption. And for the past almost, let's say several weeks, we've seen almost no oil and gas cargoes coming out of the Gulf. As you said, Iran is playing a bit of a gatekeeper function right now, deciding which of a few handfuls of ships have been able to get out, maybe get to China with some oil. But for the most part, the Gulf is still paralyzed to oil and gas traffic.
Well, and of course, the traffic is one thing, but there's also the question of the actual infrastructure that produces it in the first place. And Iran is now declaring that that infrastructure is fair game to be targeted, actually sending out a list of targets that could be aimed at for retaliation for Israel striking its South Pars gas field. This kind of escalation, is this the worst case scenario for the global energy market?
It really is among them, Kaylee. We looked at some scenarios like this for escalation before the war started, and one of them was about the two sides not just blocking each other's exports and shipping, but actually destroying offshore facilities and even onshore facilities that could take a really long time to repair and keep this supply offline for longer. And then you start to get to pricing in the oil market that's really around demand curtailment. And I think back to 2022 when the national average price of gasoline in the United States hit a record $5 per gallon. I hope we're not heading in that direction, but there are signs that we may be, especially in Asia in the physical market. That's different than what we see on the ticker here where it's only around 100. Up there, refined product prices are closer to 200 in some cases.
Wow. Well, you know, the administration's playing all the greatest hits when you get into this territory. We've already had a release approved from the SPR. President today waiving the Jones Act, which is something that we saw coming. It allows foreign flag vessels to carry goods between U.S. ports, and it gives a 60-day window. Will that make any difference?
By itself, in isolation, it might not make that much of a difference in terms of pump prices. It allows the Gulf Coast to supply the East Coast a little bit more easily and at slightly lower cost to the midstream companies. But it's not really going to put a dent in $4 a gallon gasoline, $5 a gallon gasoline if that's where we're headed. To do that, you really need those supplies, which are critical for world demand, to be resumed from the Middle East Gulf. There's really no substitute. And all of these policy accommodations that we're talking about here in town can really just buy us more time to get to that ultimate outcome.
Okay, so basically there is no policy fix for this particular problem, despite what the administration might wish. So what does that mean as we're now half an hour or so away from a Fed decision about what the monetary response is likely to be? As you talk about the idea that you need demand destruction come in, can higher interest rates fix the supply shortage problem realistically?
I don't think so, Kaylee. I think that in this environment, the number one concern is a return of general inflation. And we've fought a lot of battles in recent years to tame inflation. Monetary policy is a huge part of that. And the question now is, does the Fed have room to further cut rates if we're worried about a resurgence in inflation that comes not only from the direct effects of higher oil prices, but Joe, as you said before the segment, the cascading effects through the economy, which go to agriculture, they go to the paralyzed nature of shipping around the world and not enough capacity to move stuff around. All of this is macroeconomic risk.
Even helium is being held up, which doesn't have to do with party balloons, but in fact the creation of high-end AI chips is being used to cool these data centers. It's amazing how many tentacles there are coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. The president likes to talk about the pipes. He says, I call them the pipes. He's referring to the gas pipelines on Karg Island, which he chose not to bomb when we struck Karg Island a couple of days ago. What would happen if we did?
Well, in the scenarios we looked at, there's three levers that we could play with Karg Island, which is so important because that's where the Iranian crude exports originate. We could destroy it, but as the president pointed out, that would really be doing a disservice to the Iranian people. We're supposed to be going in to rescue them, help them with the future after this regime. We could try seizing it. We could land troops on Karg Island and get our hands on the spigot, but our troops could come under fire there. I think that that's a big risk to consider. I think that we could accomplish what we want to do if we repeat the success story from Venezuela, a naval quarantine that blocks ships carrying Iranian oil from getting to market. That would maybe level the playing field a little bit with Tehran at less risk to our servicemen and women.
If we hadn't gone into Venezuela and have the accessibility of that oil now in the global market, how much worse could this have been? What difference really is it making?
I'm afraid to say it's not making a difference at all. The extra oil from Venezuela is maybe just a couple 100,000 barrels per day. There's still around 1 million barrels per day in a 100 million barrel per day market. Yeah. It's a drop in the bucket compared to missing 10 or 15 million barrels a day from the Gulf.
Interesting. The idea of committing troops, or special ops commandos, whatever we call them, to a place like Karg Island, or, for instance, to seize the enriched uranium that we've still not located, would that be a market-moving headline to the extent that we're seeing now? Would we see further gains in oil on such a thing that many folks think is inevitable?
Well, we have a split market right now between futures, which are generally sanguine about risk, and the physical market, which is getting ready for shortages. So I think we would see price effects in both markets, and they would read it in the way that they want to read it to validate their position. So I think some people on the futures market may say, hey, it's almost over now that the U.S. is intervening on the ground. But in the physical market, they'd be worried about those supplies.
Well, as we consider that the U.S. is considering at least sending even more personnel and assets in, the president has also asked the same of allies like Europeans, who he argues, and he's right, are more exposed to this particular energy story. If you're Europe, already cut off from Russian natural gas by and large, you now have a major problem if you also can't get LNG and the like out of the Middle East. Knowing that European central banks have decisions to make this week, the ECB and the BOE on deck tomorrow, how much worse is this going to be for Europe in particular when it comes to the energy story?
It will be worse for Europe in certain fuels markets, like the middle distillate grouping, which is things like diesel, close to jet fuel. You know, Europe will have problems supplying if there's a real outage, but the number one region for concern of running shortages by far is Asia. Japan gets 78% of their supplies from the Gulf, South Korea 62%, and China, which needs 11 million barrels per day to run the show, gets about half from the Gulf. The overarching problem here is that Iran basically now controls not just the Strait of Hormuz, so we don't want to over-index there, but the whole Middle East Gulf. Until that situation changes, we are at risk of real supply shortage.
$5 diesel was a big headline yesterday. The fact that it's used for so much global shipping. What would continue increases in diesel mean for not just the energy market, but the global economy?
That's what we worry about in terms of the transference into the macroeconomic story and GDP. Because if it costs more, so diesel is the fuel of the 18-wheeler. It takes everything that we buy from market or port to stores and ultimately our doorsteps. And if they have to start working in higher prices for deliveries and transportation, prices for everything are going to go up.